Good morning or afternoon, everyone, ladies, gentlemen, our non binary friends, and of course to our PSY 105 instructor, Mrs. Nerissa and Beatriz. Our culture and its heritage reflect and shape values, beliefs, and aspirations, thereby defining people's national identity. It is important to preserve our cultural heritage because it keeps our integrity as people. I know most of you, if not all, will agree to me that Asians, especially Filipinos, are one of the races with the richest culture and diverse identity in the globe. But there are cases that we overlook this fact due to the lack of, or should I say, very limited information and studies targeting our nationality, its cultural roots, and the different contextual backgrounds inclined to it, be it in social sciences, anthropology, and particularly in psychology. Now, speaking of psychology, from the beginning of the periods when the Philippines was colonized by Spain and then the USA, academic psychology or the psychology taught in our schools was predominantly Western in theory and in methodology. Many Filipino intellectuals, notably the two Philippine heroes, Jose Rizal and Apolinario Mabini, expressed dissatisfaction at the pejorative interpretations of Filipino behavior by Western observers. This disenchantment continued as Filipinos struggled to assert their national and cultural identity. However, our people knew that we had to make things clearer for us Filipinos. Hence, the initiative of creating Sikolohiyang Pilipino as one of the solutions. This morning or afternoon, we will be learning more about Sikolohiyang Pilipino and how it emerged as to the Sikolohiyang Pilipino we know of today. But before that, allow me to introduce ourselves first. I am April Hazel Villar, and I will be joined later by two empowering ladies, Ate Charlene Bermido and Ate Desiree Manoog, your reporters for today. Now, just a disclaimer, our discussion for today will be purely based on our understandings from the contents of our sources. If there are, we do apologize for any form of misinterpretation. As we go along with our discussion, by the end you will be able to define what Sikolohiyang Pilipino is. You will learn its history, its basic tenets and principles, approaches and methods, and its four affiliations. Along with these topics, you will also find out the different distinctions we have in the form of psychology in the Philippines, and the connection and significance of Filipino psychology to the Philippine social sciences and its branches. Okay, so let's start by defining Psikolohiyang Pilipino, or in English, Filipino psychology. Psikolohiyang Pilipino is a particularistic psychology born out of the experience, thought, and orientation of Filipinos based on the full use of Filipino culture and language. You may be wondering why it is coined as a particularistic psychology, right? From the term particular, meaning specific, there may be an existing Asian psychology, but our topic for today is specified only to a psychology for Filipinos and for our identity as a nation or individuals living in the Philippines. Later on, you will know the reasons why there is a need to take action or create a type of psychology para lang sa ating mga Pilipino. This psychology is built out of our Filipino experiences, the way we think, our upbringings, and lahat ng yan bumabase sa kultura at pananalita natin. Its approach is one of the indigenization from within, whereby the theoretical framework and methodology emerge from the experiences of the people from the indigenous culture. Sikolohiyang Pilipino is based on assessing historical and social-cultural realities, understanding the local language, unraveling Filipino characteristics, and explaining them through the eyes of the native Filipino. Ayan. These resulted in a body of knowledge which includes indigenous concepts and methods. In short, a psychology which is appropriate and significant to Filipinos. Bakit? Well, basically, Filipino psychology is a great way for us to get to know ourselves in an in depth manner. Doon pa lang sa unraveling Filipino characteristics, by means of Filipino psychology, malalaman natin kung saan nga ba umuugat yung values na meron tayo or yung pag-uugali na nakikita natin sa isa't isa. You will be able to answer questions like, bakit ba importante sa ating mga Pilipino ang pagtanaw ng utang na loob? O kaya, bakit nakaka-experience tayo ng pagtampo? Filipino psychology will help us explain matters such as these ones. For its third definition, Sikolohiyang Pilipino is known to be the study of diwa or psyche. Diwa meaning wealth of ideas referred to by the philosophical concept of essence and the range of psychological concepts from awareness to motives to behavior. And so all in all, our diwa is a compilation of these two concepts, the philosophical and psychological concepts. Now, the third emphasis of Sikolohiyang Pilipino is to foster national identity and consciousness, social involvement, and psychology of language and culture, katulad nga nung nabanggit kanina. And it is concerned with the proper applications to our health, agriculture, art, mass media, religion, and other spheres of people's daily lives. Another thing you should know about Sikolohiyang Pilipino is that it is basically a study that focuses on our emotions, our experienced knowledge or kalooban and kamalayan, awareness of our surroundings or pagiging ulirat, information and understanding, pag-iisip, habits, and behavior, which is another meaning of tiwa, and the soul or kaluluwa, which acts like the window to our conscience. But the question is, why do we need Filipino psychology? Okay, just like what I have mentioned during the discussion of Bea and Julie's introductory to Sikolohiyang Pilipino and indigenous psychology, we've been making use of Western theories and methodologies, along with its concepts and principles, as our primary basis back in the years up until the present, especially in the academe. Currently, we have already gone through Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Karen Horney, Erik Erikson, Alfred Adler, and their theories, not to mention the rest of the theories and theorists we have yet to tackle. So many, but not enough to fully cover us Filipinos, and that's mainly because of our difference in culture. Now, the first reason why we need Filipino psychology is because Western approach on research of not being enmeshed and bound by the culture being studied has resulted in a characterization of the Filipino from the judgmental and impressionistic point of view of the colonizers. To reiterate what I just said, we were characterized by means of the mere judgments and impressions of these people who do not have the first hand experience of what it's like being a Filipino or what our culture truly is. Yan. This continued for centuries, and during these times, Filipino behavior has been analyzed and interpreted in the light of Western theories. For this reason, the picture of the Filipino has been inaccurate, if not distorted. As an example, the predisposition to the indirectness of Filipino communication was regarded as being dishonest and socially ingratiating. To make things clearer, let me set an example. Can you relate when we Filipinos have the tendency to prioritize other people's feelings when you are talking to each other. Like, kung may concern ka na gustong-gusto mong sabihin sa kaibigan mo, but before you do, makikiramdam ka muna kung okay lang ba yung state niya or hindi. And instead of saying your concern directly or biglaan or ng isang bagsakan lang, mas pinipili natin na himay-himayin lang para hindi nakakabigla. Minsan nga umaabot pa sa point na paikot-ikot na yung topic, 'di ba? Filipinos are known to have this kind of attitude. I mean, not all, but I guess most. But it seems like they have interpreted our indirectness as reflecting a deceptive verbal description of reality rather than a concern for the feelings of others. And so it's safe to say that it's not suitable for Filipinos to be placed under American categories and standards. That is why nagkaroon ng Filipino psychology para ma-explain or ma-expound natin ang sariling characteristics natin through our own eyes and mouth as the primary subject. The Philippine experience has proven that approaching psychology using the Western models cannot encompass the subtleties of Asian culture. Yan nga, na-mention ko na din earlier. However, Filipino psychology is not meant to be an anti-universal or to oppose or contradict any other type of psychology because inasmuch as the ultimate aim of Sikolohiyang Pilipino is to contribute to universal psychology. Yan, Sikolohiyang Pilipino is a step to contribute para makapag-contribute sa universal psychology. And that will only happen if each group of people is adequately understood by themselves and from their own perspective. Kailangan tayo mismo ang nakakaintindi sa identity natin so that we could free ourselves from being misinterpreted. Ngayon, ano nga ba ang makukuha natin sa pag-push through sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino? Siyempre, as the studies continues and as it grows even larger, pati ang scopes nito, we will be able to access a body of knowledge that includes indigenous concepts. We will also be able to develop our indigenous research methods and personality testing, diba? And we will also be able to come up with new directions when it comes to teaching psychology. And most of all, it will give the Filipino psychologists and social scientists the opportunity to actively participate their organizations, both inside and outside the Philippines. All these will benefit the psychology in the Philippines in general, our social sciences, and the way we perceive ourselves as Filipinos. Moving on, how did Sikolohiyang Pilipino begin? In the 1960s, many Filipino intellectuals were sensitive both to the inadequacy as well as the unfairness of Western oriented approaches to psychology. They were already aware of the present issues. However, there was no concerted effort to reject and correct the traditional way of teaching and studying of psychology. It was in the early 1970s that Sikolohiyang Pilipino was initiated when Virgilio Gaspar Enriquez returned to the Philippines from Northwestern University, USA, with a PhD in social psychology and lost no time in introducing the concepts of Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Together with the chairman of the Department of Psychology at the University of the Philippines, Dr. Alfredo V. Lagmay, Enriquez embarked on a research into the historical and cultural roots of Philippine psychology. Subsequently, the research included identifying indigenous concepts and approaches in Philippine psychology and developing creativity and inventiveness among Filipinos. Ayan. And then in 1975, Enriquez chaired the unang pambansang komperensya sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino or the first national conference on Filipino psychology held at the Abelardo Auditorium at UP. Here, the ideas, concepts, and formulations of Sikolohiyang Pilipino were formally articulated. Yeah. As I have mentioned, and if I can remember clearly, the name of Virgilio Gaspar Enriquez was already mentioned last discussion and was briefly introduced. But today, let us know more about him and his contributions to Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Enriquez was formally initiated into psychology in 1963 when he started teaching at the University of the Philippines at that time. And as early as 1965, he was using the Filipino language in teaching. In the 1960s, he left for the United States to pursue a master's, then later a doctoral degree in psychology sa nasabing school or university, which is Northwestern University, at Evanston, Illinois. While in this foreign land, amidst foreign theories, he watched the disenchantment of young student activists in the Philippines over the deteriorating political and social conditions of the country. So, kahit wala sa Pilipinas si Enriquez, he was very aware of what's happening here in the Philippines, especially sa students sa Pilipinas. He started preparing for the teaching of psychology in Filipino and had a number of discussions and arguments with friends and professors at Northwestern University, such as Ernesto Coley, Lee Secrest, and Donald Campbell. Enriquez then returned to the Philippines in 1971, bringing with him a wealth of Western knowledge which he did not impose on his Filipino colleagues and students. And one thing to know about Enriquez is that his Western education actually drove him to be more Filipino oriented in his teaching and research in psychology. Enriquez established the Philippine Psychology Research House, or PPRH, which later on became the Philippine Psychology Research and Training House, or PBRTH. It became home to materials on Sikolohiyang Pilipino, growing to its present size of more than 10,000 references. It also became home to research with a Filipino perspective, as well as an abode to individuals inspired by Enrique's enthusiasm, who eventually made their own contribution to the growth of Sikolohiyang Pilipino. He became chairman of the Department of Psychology in 1977 to 1982. He motivated students to write their papers in Filipino to discover important ethnic concepts, thus contributing to the growth of the national language. O, di ba? He indeed challenged his students by writing their papers and presenting them in Filipino language. He was the advisor and the reader of these theses and dissertation written in Filipino in psychology, linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, and Philippine studies. His influence went beyond UP because he taught at other institutions such as De La Salle University, Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Maynila, University of Santo Tomas, and Centro Escolar University. He was also a visiting professor at the University of Hawaii or University of Hawaii, Tokyo University for Foreign Studies, University of Malaya, and University of Hong Kong. And lastly, Enriquez received numerous awards during his lifetime. This includes different fellowships, scholarships, recognitions, and grants, both in the Philippines and internationally. He made significant contributions to the awareness of Sikolohiyang Pilipino and Asian psychology. One of his most significant award is the Outstanding Young Scientist of the Philippines from the National Academy of Science and Technology in 1982. and this was in recognition of his work in Sikolohiyang Pilipino. After his death, he was given a posthumous award, which is the National Achievement in the Social Sciences Award in 1997 by the National Research Council of the Philippines for outstanding contribution in the social sciences on a national level. Now, let's move on to the basic tenets and principles of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, which will be discussed by Ate Desiree Manaog.
So we all know that Enriquez is the father of Sikolohiyang Filipino, and he is very critical of his approach to the study of Filipino values. So the basic tenets and principles of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, according to him, has a several values, and first is the accommodative surface values. So on this Filipino values, they are expected by their neighbors to repay favors when they are required or desired, whether or not they were asked for. So using the Sikolohiyang Filipino perspective, Enriquez reconceptualized the Filipino behavior patterns and value structure where he designated the word hiya. So, hiya, propriety or dignity. So, it loosely translated as shame by most Western psychology. So, it is actually a sense of propriety. So, the word hiya, it is the uncomfortable feeling in a socially unacceptable situation. And next is the utang na loob, or gratitude or solidarity. So, it is a norm of reciprocity. So, Filipinos are expected by their neighbors to return favors, whether these were asked for or not, when it is needed or wanted. So, ang utang na loob, this is not a debt or a debt system, but a responsibility for the greater good, and it may have a negative connotation. But during the pandemic, Filipinos gave the phrase a new meaning as they banded together to support our frontliners, students, and other sectors. So by enabling their customers to fulfill their sense of responsibility to their respective communities, brands can become a platform for a change. And next is pakikisama and pakikipagkapwa. So it is a smooth interpersonal relationship as coined by Lynch, 1961 and 1973. So this attitude is primarily guided by conformity with the majority. So, in pakikisama, companionship, or esteem, this is not just a conformity, but pakikipagkapwa to make a difference. So, Enriquez explains that Filipinos are quick to help others even if they themselves are in need. So, we find solace, inspiration, and purpose from our family, friends, and workmates. And next, we have confrontative surface values. So, it refers to the ability of the Filipino to undertake revolution and uprising against a common enemy. So, under confrontative surface values, we have the word bahala na. So, this attitude loosely translated into English as fatalistic passiveness and actually describe the Filipino way of life, in which he is determined to do his best, and it came from the phrase bathalan na, meaning I will do my best, let God take care of the rest. And the word bahala na or determination, this is not a fatalism, but adding courage through faith. So the role of the divine is deeply ingrained in Filipino culture. So some argue that Filipinos rely on the intervention of a higher power, like the word bahala na si Lord, to make things right. shunning responsibility. So, bahala na is not resignation, rather a final summoning of courage before a certain reckoning point. So, according to Enrique's study, so, kailan ba kayong huling nagsabi na bahala na? So, for example, ay bahala na. Bukas na lang ako mag-review. Bukas na lang pag malapit na yung exam. So, ganun tayong mga Pilipino. So, it is very relatable. So, the next word is lakas ng loob. So, it is characterized by being courageous in the midst of problems and uncertainties. So, ang lakas ng loob, resentment or courageous, this is not just a strength, but thriving in adversity. So, refusing to stay down, Filipinos turn to online sources not only to survive, but to better themselves in the pandemic. So, many pursued upskilling through webinars and online tutorials. So, there were those who brave the challenges of starting a new business to generate more income for their families. So more than just self-promotion through communication, brands must provide avenues for consumers to express their inner strength. Especially pag we encounter challenges. So dito na lumalabas yung lakas ng loob natin, mga Pilipino. And the next is the pakikibaka. So it means concurrent clashes. So it refers to the ability of the Filipino to undertake revolutions and uprising against a common enemy. So in pakikibaka, so this is not just activism but a desire to change the world. So in his studies, Enriquez found that pakikibaka is not just for activists but for all the Filipinos. So tinatawag din itong pakikipaglaban. And the consumer or we consumer of all ages are enjoying brands to join their crusade in changing the world for the better. So a study from the Global Web Index says that nearly 60% of consumers agree that brands should have more initiative to help them during this difficult time. So he also emphasize the core or kapwa psychology. So, it means that the Filipino word kapwa is very different from this. Kapwa is the same as unity of the self and others. An English word others is actually used in opposition to the self and implies the recognition of the self as a separate identity. So in contrast, kapwa is a recognition of the shared identity and others. So based on Enriquez, the core idea of kapwa is treat others as you treat yourself because the other person is also yourself. So, at kung tinuturing nating kapwa ang ibang tao, alam din natin na meron din pagkikilala at dangal sa bawat isa. Hindi tayo nakakasakit ng iba at humingkayat tayo na maging magalang at patas at huwag manamantala. So, that's for Enriquez. So, kapwa is a core values because it is the foundation of a heart of all other values. So, under core or kapwa psychology, may dalawang categories. So, first is the ibang tao, outsider, and the second category is hindi ibang tao or one of us. So, in Filipino social interaction, one is immediately placed into one of these two categories. And now, one is placed determines the level of interaction one is shown. So, for example, under ibang tao or outsider, so there are 5 domains in this conduct. So, the first or the The first interaction is the word pakikitungo or civility. So, in Confucian ethics, it is the right behavior meant right demeanor towards authorities. And for example, when we were young, 'di ba parang takot tayong pagalitan or bigyan ng punishment ng parents natin if nakakagawa tayo ng kasalanan. So, ang ginagawa natin is sinusunod na lang natin sila. And that's what we called the pakikitungo. And next is pakikisalamuha or act of mixing. So this is a social value that is primarily communitarian, and Confucian, it espouses the ability to adapt, and we're trying to adapt with other people. And next, ang pakikilahok or act of joining. So it runs into a conflict with individual or individuality, which many Filipinos, in fact, willingly throw away in favor of conformity with the mind or with demands of those who are in charge. And to pakikisama, being united with the group, so it is like a level of adjusting. And under hindi ibang tao or one of us, there are 3 domains in this conduct. So, first is pakikipagpalagayang loob or act of a mutual trust. So, as you remember sa ibang interaction na diniscuss ko under ibang tao or outsider, so, ang pakikipagpalagayang loob, so meron na ditong level of trust. And next to it is ang pakikisangkot or act of joining to others. So we might confuse somehow in terms of pakikisalamuha or interaction with or act with. Ito yung tipong palagay na yung loob mo or somehow you might feel comfortable to that group of person. And last or the highest level is ang pakikipagkaisa. This is being one with others. So, dito na yung full trust, so, or oneness na masasabi natin. So, the difference sa pakikiisa and pakikipagpalagayang loob is yung pakikiisa, nandun na yung full trust. Kasi sa pakikipagpalagayang loob, nag-i-start pa lang yung mutual trust. So, that's under with hindi ibang tao or one of us. So, let's proceed with the next, pivotal interpersonal values. So, under in pivotal interpersonal values is pakiramdam. So, it is a shared inner perceptions, and Filipinos are used damdam or the inner perception of others' emotion as a basic tool to guide his dealings with other people. So, the word pakiramdam, it is often described as an all-important or a shared inner perception. So, it complements the shared identity of kapwa. And the word paki, it is a request, and the word ramdam, it is internality or sensitivity. So, ito ay pagkikilala sa loob ng isang tao, ayon kay Enriquez. So, knowing true feeling, participatory sensitivity, sometimes we ask other people, yung ano kayang pakiramdam ng ganito, ganyan, or minsan mayroon tayong time na tahimik lang tayo, tapos papakiramdaman natin kung ano ba yung nararamdaman ng tao na kasama natin. And that's what we called the pakiramdam. And next is, one second. So, next is linking socio-personal values. So, in linking socio-personal values, so it is generally regarded as a basic component of morally worthy behavior. So it may be translated as beauty within or to be shown to others. And under in linking socio personal values pala is ang kagandahang loob. So it is a shared humanity and it refers to being able to help other people in dire need due to a perception of being together, a part of one Filipino humanity rather. I'm sorry, humanity. So because guys, we all know naman 'di ba na ang Filipino are very hospitable, especially if ngaya may mga visitors from other countries. So we Filipinos we show act of kindness, generosity, and caring to our visitors. So dito ito rin yung mga taong like handang tumulong sa mga taong nangangailangan. So diyan na lumalabas yung kagandahang loob ng isang Pilipino. And next is the societal values. So it is somehow reflect how we relate to society. So under in societal values, we have the karangalan. So or dignity. So it is loosely translated to dignity, and this actually refers to what other people see in a person and how they use that information to make a stand or judge about his or her worth. So ang word karangalan, so it is the answer to the lack of a sense of honor, dignity, decency, self-respect, responsibility, and concern for integrity among individuals and institutions, as well as to the shameless and deceitful conduct of a persons in authority. So, under in karangalan, we have puri. So, this is the external aspect of dignity, and it may refer to how other people judge a person of his or her worth. And the word dangal, so that's the internal aspect of dignity. So it may refer also to how a person judges his own worth. And next is katarungan. So it loosely translated to justice, and this actually refers to equity in giving rewards to a person. So katarungan, it carries with it the consideration of fairness and promptness in the defense of a certain basic rights and the need for katotohanan and katwiran. So for example, yung pagbibigay ng kalayaan sa mga nasasakdal na magkaroon ng abogado bago hulihin at ikulong or pagpapakulong sa mga taong tunay na nagkasala sa pamamagitan ng pantay na paghuhusga. And next, ang kalayaan, freedom and mobility. Ironically, this may clash with the less important value of pakikisama or pakikipagbagay. So, ang kalayaan, this implies freedom of the society within the limits of the rules, laws, social norms, or resources. So, this is under with societal values. So, let's now proceed to approaches and methods. So, in approaches and methods, so I think or I believe this is a self-explanatory naman because we know that approaches or the word approaches in Filipino term is lapit and methods is pamamaraan. So in Filipino psychology are different from that of Western psychology. And in Filipino psychology, the subjects or participants called kalahok and are considered as equals in status to the researcher. So the participants are included in the research as a group and not individuals, hence anumpukan or a natural cluster. and is required to serve as the participants per se. The researcher is introduced to a natural cluster by Tulay or Bridge, who is a part of the umpukan and is a well-respected man in the community. And under in approaches and methods are the pakikipagkwentuhan. So, in this method, the researcher engages in a storytelling with an umpukan, and the researcher merely serve as the facilitator, while kalahok or participants are the ones who are to talk. The term cuento from the Spanish word cueno or cuento literally means to tell a story. And next is ang panunuluyan. So in this method, the researcher stays in the home of his kalahok or participant while he conducts the research with consent by the host family whose head serves as the tulay to an umpukan. And the term tuloy, which is the root word of the term panunuluyan, literally means to go in. And next to it is pagdadalaw-dalaw. And in this method, the researcher occasionally visits the house of his host or tulay as opposed to staying in the house. And the term dalaw literally means to visit. And ang pagtatanong-tanong. So in this method, the researcher undergoes a kind of questioning session with his kalahok or participants. So we have lead question. So lead questions, questions which directly refer to the topic being studied and are not supposed to be asked. Instead, they are derived from the answers of the participants. And the word tanong literally means questions. Question rather. And ang pakikiramdam. So in this approach, the researcher uses entirely his or her own feelings or emotions to justify if his participants are ready to be part of his research or not. And the term damdam literally means the inner perceptions of emotions. And last is ang pakapa-kapa. And in this approach, the researcher uses grouping or a mixture of feelings as well as circumstances to justify his intrusion into the life of his or her participants or kalahok. So the term kapa literally means the group in the dark.
Four Affiliations of Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Zeus Salazar, a historian, pinpointed four affiliations upon which Sikolohiyang Pilipino is rooted. These are academic scientific psychology, academic philosophical psychology, ethnic psychology, and psycho-medical religion psychology. The first one is academic scientific psychology or Sikolohiyang Akademiko-Siyentipiko. Different countries have colonized us for centuries, and they have handed down their own orientations and own perspectives to our ancestors. The academic scientific psychology promulgated from the American colonization in the Philippines. It is the Western tradition that coincided with the birth of scientific psychology in 1876 and the entry of Western psychology, mainly American tradition, at the Philippine universities. Ito daw probably yung pinaka well-known and was considered as the only valid form of psychology worth of the scientists' attention. The second affiliation is academic philosophical psychology or Sikolohiyang Akademiko-Pilosopikal, which was said to be from the Spanish colonization. It emerged through the establishment of a system of higher education in University of Santo Tomas. It is the study of psychology in the aspect of philosophy and psychology, and mainly focused on what is called the rational psychology. Ethnic psychology, or Sikolohiyang Katutubo, is the major basis of Sikolohiyang Pilipino for integrating academic scientific and academic philosophical tradition into a national tradition of psychology and philosophy as universal disciplines. This refers to the indigenous concepts that are studied using indigenous psychological orientations and methodologies. Ethnic psychology includes indigenous psychology, psychology of Filipinos, and the practice of psychology by Filipinos. The last affiliation is the psychomedical religion psychology, or Sikolohiyang Psychomedical. It is a system with religion as cohesive element and explanation. Example dito ay yung belief na pag nagkasakit ka, dahil daw yun sa may naistorbo ka na spirit. Another example dito is yung mga albularyo or faith healers na nakakapagpagaling daw ng sakit na even medical doctors cannot cure. Psychomedical religion psychology fuses native healing techniques such as hilot, kulam, lihi, pasmasusto, usog, and gaba, and explains it in an indigenous religious context. Distinctions among the forms of psychology in Philippines. We have three forms of psychology in Philippines: Psikolohiya sa Pilipinas, Psikolohiya ng mga Pilipino, at Sikolohiyang Pilipino. The first is Psikolohiya sa Pilipinas, or Psychology in the Philippines. It refers to the series of events related to the field of psychology in the Philippines. For example, the number of degree programs and journals, or the amount of research conducted about Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Ito din yung biggest, broadest form of Philippine psychology kasi dito nakapaloob lahat ng tungkol sa psikolohiya sa Pilipinas. Lahat from Luzon to Mindanao, pati na rin yung different tribes and their culture. Lahat yun nakapaloob. Lahat yun sakop nito. Psikolohiya ng mga Pilipino, or Psychology of Filipinos. It refers to any theories or knowledge of Filipino nature, regardless of source, Western or local. For example, di ba laging sinasabi na walang Filipino ang hindi marunong kumanta. Lahat daw ng Filipino magagaling kumanta based sa mga singers na nagre-represent sa bansa natin na kilala na ng ibang lahi kasi nga they are great singers. Kagaya ni Sarah G, Lea Salonga, Morissette, Four of Spades, ganun. Another example is sinasabi na one of the best crowds daw ang Filipinos when it comes to concerts and live shows. Galing siya mismo sa musical artist na nag-hold na ng shows dito sa Pilipinas. Yun. This is the most common form among the forms of psychology in the Philippines kasi madali lang siyang makita or mapuna ng kahit na sinong tao or lahi. For example, may kausap ka na foreigner. Malalaman niya na Filipino ka based sa accent mo or sa gestures. Ganon. Yun ang psikolohiya ng mga Pilipino. The last one is Sikolohiyang Pilipino, or Philippine psychology. It refers to a psychology based on the Filipinos' true thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and must derive from indigenous Filipino sources, language, and methods. This is based from the experiences, thoughts, and orientations of Filipinos, yung yung walang influence ng ibang bansa or lahi. Kumbaga, ito yung original root of Philippine psychology. Yun ang Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Lastly, we have Filipino psychology and the Philippine social sciences. The social sciences have been studied mostly from the Western perspective. So, yung mga Filipino social scientists, they introduced an indigenous or Filipino perspective to study our country's history, society, and culture. Let's define again what Sikolohiyang Pilipino is and why it is considered a social science perspective. As discussed earlier, Sikolohiyang Pilipino is a psychology born out of the experience, thought, and orientation of Filipinos, based on the full use of Filipino culture and language. It is the most important definition of Filipino orientation. On the other hand, social sciences focus on the study of ethnicity, society, culture, and its application on historical, anthropological, psychological research and practice using indigenous knowledge. From these three disciplines, history, anthropology, and psychology, emerged the three different indigenous perspectives. These are Sikolohiyang Pilipino, Pilipinolohiya, and Pantayong Pananaw. So, in Sikolohiyang Pilipino, basically we are trying to look at ourselves in the lens of our own culture as Filipinos. Ano naman ang Pilipinolohiya? Pilipinolohiya is the systematic study of the Philippines, its values and culture, and the Filipino people. It is derived from two words, Filipino and Lohiya. Lohiya is from the Latin word logos, which means systematic study, while Filipino refers to the citizens of the Philippines. So, basically, Pilipinolohiya, ito yung kwento at kasaysayan ng Filipino, ng pagiging Filipino, at ng iba't ibang paraan ng pagiging Filipino. It was developed to understand the Filipino psyche, Filipino culture, and Filipino society. Pilipinolohiya is open to Western theories and concepts as long as they are appropriate to fit the Filipino context. It is developed in the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and had become part of the curricula in some colleges and universities inside and outside the Philippines. So next is Pantayong Pananaw. Pantayong Pananaw came from the words pantayo and pananaw. Pantayo was derived from the root word tayo, which means we, while pananaw means perspective, thus translated as the from us to us perspective in the Philippine historiography. Pantayong Pilipino is also called Bagong Kasaysayan or New History and is currently the most theoretically elaborate articulation of an indigenized social science perspective that offers a viable alternative to Western positivist social science. It seeks to create a closed circuit of interaction between academic discourse, especially in history, and kaalamang katutubo or indigenous knowledge. Pantayong Pananaw also calls for indigenous concepts and methodologies have been raised in social science disciplines, notably in psychology with Sikolohiyang Pilipino and in anthropology with Filipinolohiya. Pantayong pananaw is developed as a response to the westernized perspective of the study of Philippine history. So, through our own perspective, Filipinos can understand and communicate freely with each other through the use of our own language, interests, and concepts. These three concepts discussed, Sikolohiyang Pilipino, Filipinolohiya, and Pantayong Pananaw, lahat sila umiikot sa idea of studying Filipino culture, Filipino behavior, values, language, and society. They are interrelated with each other because their subject of study is the Philippines and the Filipino people. Kung ano yung results and findings ng researches ng isa, it will surely affect and contribute to the other concepts. That is why these three are considered social science perspective. So that's all. Thank you so much for listening.